Jasmine Carter took a deep breath as she stood in the middle of her restaurant, Soul and Spice. The soft jazz music playing in the background mixed perfectly with the gentle chatter of happy customers. The warm amber lights she had picked out herself cast a golden glow over the dark wooden tables. She closed her eyes for just a moment, taking it all in. The smell of her grandmother's special spice mix coming from the kitchen, the sound of glasses clinking at the bar, and the feeling of finally being exactly where she was meant to be. At 35, Jasmine had walked a long, hard road to get here. Nobody had handed her anything. She had started washing dishes at a busy downtown restaurant when she was just 19 years old. Back then, her hands would get so dry and cracked from the hot water and harsh soaps that she'd have to slather them with petroleum jelly every night before bed. But she never complained, not once. Every single day, she'd peek into the kitchen whenever she could, watching the chefs work their magic, storing away their techniques in her mind like precious treasures. One day, she'd whisper to herself as she scrubbed dried sauce off yet another pot, "One day that'll be me." Her co-workers had gotten used to seeing Jasmine with a notebook, scribbling down recipes and ideas during her breaks. Some laughed at her dreams, told her to be realistic. But Jasmine had her grandmother's stubbornness. Once she set her mind to something, that was that. For almost 7 years, Jasmine worked full-time during the day and attended culinary school at night. She'd get home past midnight, feet swollen, back aching, only to wake up at dawn and do it all over again. She moved from dishwasher to prep cook, then line cook, sous chef, and finally head chef at a well-respected bistro. All while saving every extra penny she could. "You're crazy to work this hard," her friend Tanya would tell her. "Nobody should have 2 full-time jobs." "It's not forever," Jasmine would always answer, "just until I get my place." The memory of her grandmother's kitchen was what kept her going during the hardest times. Growing up, that kitchen had been Jasmine's safe place, the warm heart of her childhood home, where she learned how to make cornbread so fluffy it could float and collard greens that would make grown men cry with joy. Her grandmother never measured anything, cooking purely by feel, taste, and generations of passed-down wisdom. "Food brings people together," her grandmother used to say. "When you feed someone, you're giving them more than just a meal. You're giving them comfort, happiness, and a moment of peace in this crazy world." Now, after 15 years of sweat, tears, and more burns on her arms than she could count, Jasmine had transformed an old brick building into her dream. 3 months ago, she had opened the doors to Soul and Spice, bringing her grandmother's southern soul food recipes into the modern world with her own creative twists. The food critics had been surprisingly kind. A refreshing take on traditional cuisine, one had written. "Carter doesn't just cook food, she tells her family's story through each dish." The locals seemed to agree. Reservations were getting harder to come by each week. Jasmine walked over to table 7, where an elderly couple was finishing their meal. The woman reached out and gently touched Jasmine's arm. "Honey, that sweet potato pie took me right back to my mama's kitchen in Georgia. I haven't tasted anything like that in 30 years. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. "That's my grandmother's recipe. She'd be so happy to hear you say that." Even with 12 employees now, Jasmine still worked the floor several nights a week. She loved watching people's faces as they took their first bites, loved hearing their stories and connecting with them. This wasn't just a business to her, it was a calling, a way to honor her roots while growing something new. As she cleared the couple's plates, Jasmine glanced around her restaurant once more. From the artwork by local black artists on the walls to the playlist of jazz and soul music to the menu written in her own handwriting, every detail reflected who she was. This place was her heart made visible, her dreams turned real. And this was just the beginning. The Friday evening rush hit Soul and Spice like a tidal wave. Every table was booked, the bar area packed with people waiting for a chance to taste Jasmine's famous honey-glazed cornbread and spicy shrimp gumbo. The kitchen hummed with activity as cooks called orders back and forth, the clatter of pots and sizzle of food on hot grills creating a familiar symphony. Jasmine was in her office going over the week's expenses when her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and frowned. It was a text from Lisa at head waitress. "Got the flu. 102 fever. Can't make it in. So sorry." Jasmine rubbed her temples. Lisa was her most experienced server, the one who handled the big spenders and kept everything running smoothly on the floor. And tonight was looking to be their busiest evening yet. "Just what we needed," Jasmine muttered, pushing back from her desk. She peeked through the small window in her office door, surveying the dining room. Every seat was filled, the line at the door growing longer, and her 3 remaining servers were already racing between tables, their faces showing the strain. For a split second, Jasmine considered calling some regulars to reschedule, but she quickly shook off the thought. These people had made reservations weeks ago. She wouldn't disappoint them. "Looks like I'm going back to my roots tonight," she said to herself, hanging up her chef's coat and rolling up the sleeves of her burgundy button-down shirt. She pulled her dreadlocks back, securing them with a hair tie she kept on her wrist for kitchen work. She stepped out of her office and made her way to the service station where Ty, a college kid working part-time, was frantically entering orders into the computer system. "Chef, we're drowning out here," he said, not looking up from the screen. "Not chef tonight. Just Jasmine the server," she replied, grabbing an apron from the hook and tying it around her waist with practiced ease. "Lisa's sick. I'm stepping in." Ty finally looked up, relief washing over his face. "For real? But you're the boss." "And before I was the boss, I was a server for 7 years," Jasmine said, picking up a notepad and stuffing some pens in her apron pocket. "Never forgot how to do it either." She quickly checked herself in the mirror behind the bar, adjusting her small gold hoop earrings, her grandmother's, the ones she wore for good luck on important nights. Then she took a deep breath and dove into the chaos. Jasmine moved between tables with the same focus she brought to cooking a perfect meal. She remembered all the little tricks, keeping a mental map of who needed what, timing her approaches so she could handle multiple tables at once, chatting just enough to make customers feel special without slowing down service. "How's everything tasting, folks?" she asked a family enjoying their meal. The father gave her a thumbs up, his mouth too full of her famous fried chicken to speak. "This sauce is incredible," his wife said. "What's in it?" Jasmine smiled, leaning in slightly. "Family secret. My grandmother would rise from her grave and haunt me if I told." They laughed, and Jasmine moved on to her next table, refilling water glasses and taking dessert orders. Her feet were starting to ache. Cooking in the kitchen was hard work, but serving involved a different kind of physical strain. Still, there was something satisfying about connecting directly with the people enjoying her food. 2 hours into her unexpected shift, sweat beaded on Jasmine's forehead as she balanced 4 plates of food along her arm. She'd forgotten how hot it got on the floor, moving constantly under the dining room lights. But the rhythm of service was coming back to her, like riding a bicycle after years away. "Who ordered the blackened catfish with red beans and rice?" She called out to a table of 4 businesswomen. "That's me," said one, smiling up at Jasmine. "Are you usually a server here?" Jasmine set down the plate carefully. "Just helping out tonight. We're a little short-staffed." "Well, the service hasn't suffered a bit," another woman said. "This place is amazing." "Thank you," Jasmine replied, genuine pride warming her chest. "We try our best." Maya, the young hostess, caught Jasmine's eye from the front door and pointed discreetly to her watch. The 7:30 reservations would be arriving soon, and they were already stretched thin. Jasmine nodded in understanding. They'd make it work. They always did. What she didn't know was that among those 7:30 reservations was a group that would test her patience, professionalism, and pride in ways she never expected. The front door of Soul and Spice swung open right at 7:30, bringing in a blast of cool evening air along with 4 sharply dressed people. Jasmine noticed them immediately from across the dining room. Something about the way they entered, like they owned the place, made them stand out from her usual customers. The man leading the group wore an expensive-looking gray suit that probably cost more than Jasmine's first car. His black leather shoes gleamed under the restaurant lights, and the gold watch on his wrist caught the light every time he moved his hand. Next to him stood a tall woman in a red dress, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Behind them were another man and woman, both looking around the restaurant with curious eyes. Maya, the hostess, greeted them with her usual warm smile. She was a sweet college kid who worked weekends to help pay for her nursing classes. Jasmine watched as the girl's smile faltered slightly. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could read body language well enough to know something was off. Jasmine quickly delivered a basket of cornbread to table 12, then made her way to the front. "Everything okay here, Maya?" she asked, stepping beside the young hostess. Maya looked relieved to see her. "These guests don't have a reservation, but they're hoping for a table right away." The man in the gray suit turned his attention to Jasmine, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was something cold in his gaze that made her wish she wasn't wearing a server's apron. "I'm Richard Whitfield," he said, as if the name should mean something to her. "I run Whitfield Properties downtown. We need a table for 4 immediately." Jasmine recognized the name now. His company owned half the high-rises downtown, and his face occasionally appeared in the local business section. She glanced around the packed dining room, where every single table was filled with people enjoying their meals. "Good evening, Mr. Whitfield," Jasmine said politely. "I see you didn't call ahead for a reservation. We're completely booked tonight, but I think we can squeeze you in if you're willing to wait about 15 minutes. Our bar area is comfortable, and the first round of drinks would be on the house for the inconvenience." Richard's jaw tightened. The woman in the red dress beside him touched his arm gently, as if trying to calm him down. "We have clients with us," he said, nodding toward the couple behind him. "Important clients. I was told this was the hot new place in town, but if you can't accommodate us—" "We absolutely can," Jasmine assured him. "Just a short wait. I promise it'll be worth it." The second woman spoke up. "The bar is fine. I've heard amazing things about the cocktails here." Jasmine smiled gratefully at her, then gestured toward the bar area where several leather stools stood empty. "Miguel makes the best old-fashioned in the city. Please make yourselves comfortable, and I'll come get you personally as soon as your table is ready." Richard looked like he wanted to argue more, but his clients were already moving toward the bar. With a tight nod, he followed them. As they walked away, Maya leaned closer to Jasmine. "Sorry about that. He was really pushing for a table right away." "You handled it perfectly," Jasmine assured her. "Some people just aren't used to hearing wait." For the next 15 minutes, Jasmine kept one eye on the group at the bar while serving her other tables. Richard seemed to be drinking his whiskey faster than his companions, his expression growing darker with each sip. Twice she caught him staring at her, his eyes narrowing in a way that made her skin crawl. Jasmine checked with table 7, an older couple finishing up their dessert. They assured her they were done and would be heading out soon. Perfect timing. After they left, she quickly helped the busboy clear their dishes and wipe down the table. Then she straightened her apron, put on her best professional smile, and walked over to the bar. "Mr. Whitfield, your table is ready now." Richard stood up, wobbling slightly. "About time," he muttered, just loud enough for Jasmine to hear. As she led them through the crowded dining room, Jasmine could feel Richard's eyes on her back. A prickle of unease crept up her spine. In all her years of restaurant work, she'd developed a sixth sense about difficult customers, and everything about Richard Whitfield was setting off alarm bells. "Here we are," she said, showing them to the freshly cleaned table. "Tonight's specials are written on the board, and I'll be your server this evening. Can I start you with some water while you look at the menu?" Richard slid into his chair, a sour expression on his face. "We've waited long enough. Let's skip the pleasantries and get on with it." Jasmine's smile didn't falter, though it no longer reached her eyes. This was going to be a long night. Jasmine placed the menus in front of each person at Richard's table, trying to ignore the way he drummed his fingers impatiently on the tablecloth. The restaurant was still packed, the noise of happy diners and clinking silverware filling the air around them. "Our chef's special tonight is blackened catfish with Creole sauce and dirty rice," she explained, speaking clearly so they could hear her over the restaurant noise. "And we have a beautiful peach cobbler for dessert, made fresh this morning." "Listen, girl," Richard cut her off, waving his hand dismissively. "We're in a hurry. I don't need the whole song and dance routine. Just get someone competent to take our orders." A heavy silence fell over the table. The woman in the red dress looked down at her lap. One of the clients, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jasmine took a deep breath, keeping her face neutral despite the sting of his words. 15 years in the restaurant business had given her thick skin, but some comments still had the power to catch her off guard. "I'd be happy to take your order whenever you're ready, sir," she replied evenly. Would you like to hear about our wine selection? We have several options that pair beautifully with tonight's special. Richard rolled his eyes. Just bring us a bottle of your most expensive red. At least that should be decent. Very good, sir, Jasmine said, keeping her voice steady. She turned to the others at the table. Would anyone like to start with an appetizer? The female client, a black woman with elegant gray streaks in her hair, smiled kindly at Jasmine. The crab cakes sound wonderful. Could you tell us more about them? Before Jasmine could answer, Richard interrupted again. We don't have time for a full culinary lecture. Just bring the wine and take the order. Jasmine nodded politely and stepped away from the table. In the short walk to the bar to get their wine, she rolled her shoulders back and took 3 deep breaths, a technique her grandmother had taught her for dealing with difficult people. You okay? Miguel asked as he handed her a bottle of their finest Cabernet. Nothing I haven't handled before, Jasmine replied with a small smile, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. When she returned with the wine, she could hear Richard talking as she approached. He lowered his voice slightly when he saw her, but not enough. They'll let anyone serve tables these days. Probably couldn't get a real job, he was saying to his companions. Then, looking directly at Jasmine as she poured the wine, he added, I'm surprised they'd have someone like you as the face of the restaurant. Not exactly the image most places want to project. The woman with the gray streaks cleared her throat loudly. Richard, can we discuss the property details? That's why we're here. But Richard seemed determined to make Jasmine's job as difficult as possible. When she returned with their appetizers, he complained that the crab cakes were too small. When she brought their entrees, he claimed his steak was overcooked, even though he'd ordered it well done. Throughout the meal, he snapped his fingers to get her attention. Hey girl, more water over here, or you people never bring enough bread, do you? Each time, Jasmine responded with quiet professionalism, treating him with a respect he hadn't earned. She'd been dealt worse hands in life than an entitled customer with a chip on his shoulder. At a nearby table, an older couple watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. The woman caught Jasmine's eye and mouthed, I'm sorry, when Richard wasn't looking. Jasmine gave her a small nod of appreciation. Despite Richard's behavior, Jasmine made sure their meal went smoothly. She checked on them regularly, refilled their drinks without being asked, and brought extra sides when the clients mentioned how delicious everything was. By the time they finished their main course, the woman with gray streaks was clearly embarrassed by Richard's behavior. The male client had grown quieter throughout the meal, his eyes apologetic whenever Jasmine approached the table. Would anyone care for dessert? Jasmine asked as she cleared their plates. Just the check, Richard said sharply. Then, looking directly at Jasmine with a smirk, he added, and I'd like to speak to the manager about the quality of service in this establishment. The others at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Actually, the woman in the red dress spoke up. I'd love to try that peach cobbler you mentioned. Richard shot her an annoyed look but didn't argue. I'll bring that right out, Jasmine said calmly, and I'll let the manager know you'd like to speak with them. As she walked away, she heard Richard say, about time someone competent took over. Little did he know, he was about to get exactly what he asked for. Jasmine pushed through the kitchen doors, the sounds of sizzling pans and busy cooks momentarily drowning out the restaurant chatter. She placed the dessert order for peach cobbler with Ben, her pastry chef, then leaned against the wall for just a moment. She closed her eyes and counted to 10. Tough table, Ben asked, already plating the cobbler with a scoop of homemade vanilla ice cream. You could say that, Jasmine replied, straightening her apron. Nothing I can't handle. Truth was, Richard's comments had gotten under her skin more than she wanted to admit. Not because they were new. She'd heard similar things throughout her career, but because tonight, in her own restaurant, she'd had to swallow her pride and play the role of just a waitress. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. She took the beautifully plated dessert from Ben and pushed the kitchen door open with her hip. As she crossed the dining room toward Richard's table, she made a decision. Enough was enough. When she reached the table, she placed the cobbler in front of the woman in the red dress. One peach cobbler with vanilla bean ice cream, she said with a warm smile. Then she turned to Richard, who was checking his expensive watch impatiently. I understand you wanted to speak to the manager? Jasmine asked. Finally, Richard huffed. Yes, I'd like to discuss the quality of service in this establishment. It's been completely unacceptable. The woman with gray streaks in her hair looked mortified. Richard, please. No, it's okay, Jasmine interrupted gently. Feedback is important to us. She paused, taking in the expectant look on Richard's face. He was clearly waiting for her to scurry off and fetch someone he deemed more important. Instead, Jasmine pulled out the empty chair at their table and sat down. Richard's eyebrows shot up. What do you think you're doing? Actually, sir, Jasmine said calmly, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not just your server tonight. I'm Jasmine Carter, the owner and executive chef of Soul and Spice. The table fell silent. Richard's face froze in mid-smirk, his mouth slightly open but no words coming out. The woman with the gray streaks covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. The other two guests looked equally shocked. You're the owner? Richard finally managed to sputter. Yes, Jasmine replied simply. She untied her apron and placed it on her lap. I stepped in as a server tonight because my head waitress is ill with the flu. I believe in knowing every aspect of my business. The woman in the red dress put her fork down slowly. The food is absolutely extraordinary. Did you really create all these recipes? Jasmine nodded. Many are based on my grandmother's cooking with my own modern twist. I trained at the Culinary Institute and worked under Chef Thomas for 7 years before opening Soul and Spice. The male client leaned forward, genuine interest on his face. My compliments to the chef then. I mean, to you. The short ribs were the best I've had in this city. Richard's face had turned an interesting shade of red. He reached for his water glass, nearly knocking it over in the process. And while I value all feedback about our service, Jasmine continued, her voice steady and dignified, I don't tolerate disrespect toward any of my staff, including myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at his plate, unable to meet her eyes. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Jasmine stood up. Now, was there specific feedback you wanted to share about the food or service? I'm always looking to improve the dining experience for our guests. Richard cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable. The food was fine. Just fine? Jasmine raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. Excellent, he mumbled. It was excellent. The woman with gray streaks reached across the table and touched Jasmine's hand. The meal was wonderful, and your staff is lovely. Please don't judge us all by, she glanced at Richard, by certain behaviors. Of course not, Jasmine replied graciously. At Soul and Spice, we believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. It's not just about the food, it's about creating a space where people feel welcome. She emphasized the last word just slightly, her eyes flickering briefly to Richard. The meaning wasn't lost on him. He shifted in his seat, looking like a man who suddenly realized he'd made a terrible mistake. I'll have your check prepared, Jasmine said, rising from the table. Thank you for dining with us tonight. As she walked away, head held high, she could feel the eyes of nearby diners on her. Some had overheard the exchange, and a few nodded in quiet approval. In that moment, Jasmine felt a complicated mix of emotions, pride in her restaurant, satisfaction at Richard's embarrassment, but also a familiar sadness that such encounters were still part of her reality. Jasmine returned to the kitchen, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. She leaned against the steel prep table, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. The kitchen staff continued their work, but she noticed a few curious glances. You okay, boss? Ben asked, sliding a freshly plated key lime pie onto the pass. I'm fine, she said, managing a small smile. Just had to set someone straight. She hadn't planned to reveal herself as the owner. In fact, she had been perfectly content to let Richard continue thinking she was just a waitress until he decided to speak to the manager. The look on his face when she told him the truth was something she wouldn't soon forget. Jasmine took a deep breath and returned to the dining room. As she approached Richard's table with the check, she could see they were huddled in conversation, speaking in hushed tones that quickly died down as she neared. Richard's face was still flushed with embarrassment. He fumbled with his wallet, avoiding her eyes as he pulled out a credit card. I'll take care of the bill, he muttered. The woman with gray streaks in her hair reached out and touched Jasmine's arm. Your food was absolutely outstanding, she said, genuine warmth in her eyes. I'd love to hear the story behind some of these recipes sometime. Thank you, Jasmine replied. My grandmother was from New Orleans. She taught me everything I know about real soul food cooking. I've added my own touches over the years, but the heart of each dish is hers. Well, she'd be very proud, the woman said. I'm Gloria, by the way. I run a small art gallery downtown. Nice to meet you, Gloria, Jasmine said, taking the credit card from Richard. I'll be right back with your receipt. As she walked away, she heard Gloria saying something to Richard in a stern, quiet voice. The man looked thoroughly chastised. When Jasmine returned with the receipt, Richard scribbled his signature without looking up. The tip amount made her eyebrows raise slightly. It was more than generous, almost as if he was trying to buy forgiveness. Money wasn't what she wanted from him, but she wasn't about to refuse it either. That money would go straight into her staff's tip pool. Thank you for dining with us, she said professionally as they gathered their things to leave. Richard finally looked up, making brief eye contact. The food was excellent, he said stiffly, clearly uncomfortable. I apologize for any misunderstanding. It wasn't a real apology, not for the racist comments, not for the disrespect, but Jasmine hadn't expected one. People like Richard rarely acknowledged their prejudices. As they stood to leave, the man who had ordered the short ribs handed her a business card. I'm on the board of the Chamber of Commerce, he said quietly. We'd love to feature your restaurant in our next newsletter. This place is exactly what our city needs. Thank you, Jasmine said, genuinely touched. That would be wonderful. Gloria also pressed a card into her hand. I host dinner parties for potential gallery clients. I'd love to discuss catering options sometime. Richard watched this exchange with a pinched expression. His clients were clearly impressed with Jasmine and her restaurant, despite his attempts to diminish her. As they made their way to the exit, Jasmine walked beside them. At the door, she paused and turned to Richard. Just so you know, she said in a clear voice that carried just far enough, 10% of our profits go to a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth interested in culinary careers, kids who might otherwise be told they couldn't get real jobs. Richard's eyes widened slightly at having his words thrown back at him. He gave a curt nod and hurried out the door, his clients following behind. Gloria turned back at the last moment and gave Jasmine a small, approving smile. When they were gone, Jasmine felt the tension leave her shoulders. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding in throughout the evening. Maya appeared at her side. That was amazing, the young hostess whispered. The way you handled him. I've never seen anything like it. You didn't even raise your voice. Jasmine smiled. My grandmother always said dignity speaks louder than shouting ever could. She looked around her restaurant, at the happy customers enjoying their meals, at her staff working efficiently despite being short-handed, at the warm lighting that made everyone look their best. This was her dream, realized through years of hard work and determination. No one, not even people like Richard Whitfield, could take that away from her. Come on, she said to Maya, straightening her shoulders. We've got a full house to serve. The night's not over yet. Word spread quickly about what happened that night at Soul and Spice. By the next morning, Jasmine's phone was buzzing with text messages from her staff who had heard bits and pieces of the story. Even in a city this size, restaurant gossip traveled fast. You should have seen her face when I told her, Jasmine told her sister Tanya over coffee the next day. They sat at Jasmine's kitchen table, morning light streaming through the window, like he'd seen a ghost. Tanya laughed, shaking her head. Bet he won't be making those comments to servers anymore. Maybe not, Jasmine said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. People like that don't change overnight. But at least he knows he picked the wrong restaurant to act a fool in. Rather than dwelling on the negative experience, Jasmine did what she always did when faced with a challenge. She turned it into fuel. The following week, she called a meeting with her small management team. I want to expand our scholarship program, she announced, spreading a handwritten proposal across the table. Right now, we're helping one culinary student a year. I think we can do more. Her restaurant manager, Louis, looked over the numbers. We're doing well, but this is ambitious, Jasmine. You sure about this? Dead sure, she replied. There are too many talented kids out there who never get the chance I got. We're going to change that, one student at a time. Over the next 6 months, Soul and Spice grew in ways Jasmine hadn't expected. Gloria from the art gallery became a regular customer, bringing artists and collectors who appreciated good food. The Chamber of Commerce feature brought in business travelers and locals who had never ventured to this part of town before. Jasmine expanded her mentorship initiative, inviting high school students from underprivileged neighborhoods to shadow her kitchen staff on weekends. She remembered her own teenage years, how badly she had wanted someone to show her the ropes, to tell her that her dreams weren't foolish. Cooking isn't just about food, she told a wide-eyed teenager named Deanda as he learned to make her grandmother's famous roux. It's about history, culture, sharing something of yourself with others. Every dish tells a story. In the fall, a national food magazine contacted her about a feature. When the issue came out, Jasmine was on the cover, standing tall in her chef's coat, arms crossed confidently over her chest. The headline read, "Soul and Spice: How Jasmine Carter is Redefining Southern Cuisine." The article highlighted not just her innovative cooking, but her commitment to creating opportunities in the industry. Orders for her bottled sauces, a side business she'd started just 3 months earlier, tripled overnight. Reservations became nearly impossible to get, with weekends booked solid 3 months in advance. Jasmine hired more staff, expanded the dining room into the vacant space next door, and still kept the same warm, welcoming atmosphere. And occasionally, she still put on an apron and served tables. "Why do you still do this?" her new head waitress asked one night. "You don't need to anymore." Jasmine smiled, balancing 3 plates along her arm with practiced ease. "This keeps me honest, keeps me connected to the people eating my food. The day I think I'm too good to serve others is the day I need to quit this business." One evening, almost exactly a year after the incident, Jasmine was checking inventory in the stockroom when Lewis knocked on the door. "Someone's here asking for you," he said, a strange expression on his face. "Says he's with the City Food Critics Association." Jasmine followed him to the dining room, straightening her chef's coat as she walked. There, at a corner table, sat Richard Whitfield. He was alone this time, a notebook open beside his water glass. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Richard stood and extended his hand. "Miss Carter," he said formally, "I'm here to review your restaurant for our annual awards. I've heard it's the best in the city." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, taking in the man who had dismissed her so easily a year before. He looked different somehow, less arrogant, more uncertain. "We serve everyone here, Mr. Whitfield," she said, taking his hand in a firm handshake. "I hope you enjoy your meal." As she walked back to the kitchen, Jasmine felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Success, she reflected, was indeed the best response to those who underestimated you. But creating opportunities for others to succeed, that was her true legacy. And no one could take that away from her.